Hello and good evening all. Tonight we're tackling one of Porsche's many iconic racers, the second of their cars to bear the iconic Carrera moniker, and in my opinion, possibly the prettiest of their racing cars, with stiff competition from some of their other late 60s, early 70s prototypes. The 904 came about at a time of shifting priorities for Porsche. Their formula programs, which had been going for several years by 1962, had not produced compelling results using modified versions of their sports cars. The 804, which debuted in 1962, was designed by the third generation of Ferdinand Porsches, the Ferdinand Alexander, helpfully nicknamed Butzi, to distinguish him from his grandfather Ferdinand or father Ferdinand Ferry. Despite a very sleek body, a newly developed Boxer 8, new to Porsche disc brakes, and a driver roster featuring, rather oddly, no Germans, instead there was Phil Hill, one of only two Americans to eventually become F1 world champion, Joe Bonnier, fresh off a Sebring 12 Hours victory in a privateer Ferrari, and once and future President Dan Gurney. Although how they fit Dan's 6'4" frame into that tiny car is a mystery to me, as he was only just more than a foot shorter than the 804's entire length. Nevertheless, the 804 never lived up to expectations. Faced with much more powerful contemporaneous entries from Ferrari, Lotus, and BRM, a disappointing first two races led to extensive development work in time for the French Grand Prix, that year held at Rouen-les-Essarts. Perhaps because everyone that wasn't French struggled to get directions to Reims, because even with the idiosyncrasies of the French language, it just doesn't make any sense for something that's spelled R-E-I-M-S, or more logically pronounced Reims, that is instead pronounced Reims. French language notwithstanding, Gurney made up for his near victory at Reims the previous year, having that time been unwilling to make what he considered an unsportsmanlike blocking maneuver to defend his place in the final seconds, and took the 804 home to its only championship victory, admittedly against somewhat reduced competition. Ferrari had to sit out the race due to a strike, unsurprisingly because Italy and summer, and the Jim Clark Lotus and Graham Hill BRM cars that would have provided the rest of the main competition for Gurney's sixth-place grid position both retired with mechanical issues. But what, I hear you cry with gnashing teeth and wailing elbows, does this have to do with the 904 Carrera you said you were going to talk about?
Get on with it!
Well, at the end of the season, the team withdrew from formula racing to focus on sports car and endurance racing, as these were seen as higher ROI-generating activities, more in tune with the Porsche brand equity. Butzi's focus was shifted from the 804 to developing an endurance-focused replacement for the 718, as the 804 had been its successor in Formula One. He had just finished up the 901 design, that we now know as the 911 because of some trademark disputes with Peugeot, and turned his pen to what would become the 904. Draped in coupe bodywork inspired by a late variant of the 718, the GTR, that had just brought home yet another Targa Florio victory for Porsche, the 904 was, in addition to being much prettier than the 718 GTR, nevertheless a vehicle of compromises. While the top-end racing cars of the time typically used complex tube space frame chassis and hand-wrought body panels, the 904 was not intended to be a low-volume, factory-only, or highly exclusive product. At the same time, most volume production racers were simply pulled off the line late in their assembly and then vaguely fiddled with to make them track ready, if they received that treatment at the factory at all. Far more of them received the treatment far after the fact in independent shops. Both of these solutions generally introduced more deleterious compromises into the design than the Porsche team felt was desirable for their new car. Thus, accepting certain aspects from the design outset with a racing focus helped both narrow the design remit and ensure the success of the vehicle in the long run. To this point, the 904 had a unique semi-ladder chassis with two box beams supporting pressed steel components, with fiberglass body panels that were bonded and bolted directly to the chassis, which both saved money and ensured an exceptionally rigid platform with a very low-drag exterior. Incidentally, the low-drag bodywork, particularly the low and relatively sloped rear, meant that the 904 could also be used as an inadvertent ramp in a rear-end collision and could cause accidents like this to occur. I share this photo only because the drivers in both cars were unharmed, and let's be honest, it's a pretty cool picture. You can see the 904 which is technically a Beck replica, just there in the background with most of its rear bodywork missing. The body panels, interestingly, were produced by Heinkel, yes, they of the Luftwaffe bombers, in an amusingly slapdash process that involved spraying chopped fiberglass slurry into a panel mold, with spray rates reportedly being somewhat variable. This led to less than consistent weights for each model that made it off the production line depending on how thick all the body panels were. Maybe that's part of the reason that Heinkel was defunct and absorbed by VFW in 1965. Anyway, the original plan for the 904 called for its sharing a tuned-up version of the flat 6 engine designed for the new 901. But development delays on this power plant meant that the car originally shipped with an improved version of the 718's 2-liter Boxer 4. This complex 4-cam unit produced 180 horsepower and was prized for its durability, but proved quite difficult to manufacture in quantity. This engine did send power to the rear wheels through a 5-speed gearbox with multiple ratio options, swappable based on the exigencies of competition, and available in a wide range of ratios for everything from high-speed circuits like Spa and La Sarthe to short ratios for hill climb events. Suspension was dibbles. Yes, it was dibbles. Suspension was double wishbones and coil springs at the front with non-symmetrical diagonal arms and struts at the rear. The disc brakes were co-developed between Porsche and ATE. It was an iteration from a gearling design originally produced under license earlier that decade. While, as mentioned, car weight varied because of the manufacturing processes, race vehicles typically weighed in at an average of 655 kilos, or 1,443 pounds dry, while road-going versions were a mite heavier due to additions such as a full interior, a heater, and some sound-deadening insulation. As the 1960s was the beginning of the end of the period of divergence between road cars and race cars, the 904 had a not insignificant required production of 100 road-legal cars to meet its homologation to be able to compete in FIA events. Production began in late 1963 and finished in September 1964, with 106 cars rolling off the line in total, despite sufficient orders to justify far greater production. When the 6-cylinder engine was ready for the 901 and subsequently tuned up, 6 904s were also built with that engine and run by the Porsche factory team, dubbed the 904-6. Although a number of 4-cylinder equipped cars were also sent back to Stuttgart for upgrading to the new 200 horsepower engine, which I'll cover more closely in a future video. There was also a run of 3 cars, again all factory racers, fitted with a version of that flat 8 from the 804. See, I told you there was relevance to that part of the story. This was rapidly detuned down to 225 horsepower after those engines demonstrated a remarkable propensity for detonating their flywheels, which I am reliably informed is
not great, Bob.
5 additional open-topped 904s, the Spiders, were also completed with this power plant for the 1965 season, but apart from the underlying mechanicals, they bore very little resemblance to the closed-top cars. The majority of production, however, remained with the original 4-cylinder engine, and this combination was a winning one. Despite a few early mechanical niggles, an outright 1-2 at the 1964 Targa Florio showed the model's promise, and the durability of the car turned out to be its most excellent attribute. I'm throwing in some of these pictures of the 904 competing with vastly inappropriate cars, just as both a point of amusement, a good display of just how large even sports cars have become over the years, and to show off just what kind of wonderful things you get at the historic sports car racing events hither, tither, and yon throughout the United States. I highly recommend going if and when you have the opportunity. Wins came, either in class or outright, at Le Mans, the Nürburgring, Spa, Reims, and a whole raft of road rallies on both sides of the Atlantic, propelling the car to take the 2-liter GT trophy in the World Sports Car Championship for both 64 and 65, and the model continued to be competitive through 1966, when more powerful cars from other manufacturers, as well as Porsche's own new 906, came into their own and pushed the 904 into superannuation. The 904 nevertheless served as the starting point for the whole family of late 60s and early 70s Porsche prototypes that culminated in the 917s and kicked off more than a decade of Porsche dominance of endurance racing. This success has also translated into the model's enduring popularity as a kit car, and it is one of the most widely reproduced vintage racers. Other contenders for the spot being the GT40, the 917K, and the 550 Spider. If I've forgotten anything else that made a big splash in the kit car world, let me know in the comments. Most of the photos for this video have actually been of Beck 904 kit cars, although the shots from Le Mans Classic are a mix of 904s and 904-6s. One can easily tell the difference by the centrally located filler cap on the 904-6. That brings us to the end of another video, and for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Go ahead and put the weirdest conspiracy theory you either like or believe in the comments. I'll kick off with the Apollo 20 hoax, as even though it's been disproven, hence it being hoax, I love the level of thought and attention to detail that went into coming up with it. It's definitely worth a Wikipedia article read at least. With that, it just leaves me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all a good night and a good tomorrow.